For the next part of this tutorial, we're going to be learning how to plot our data into a graph using Microsoft Excel. This tutorial is for the 2007 version of Microsoft Excel. So if you have an earlier version, there is a tutorial for that. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is to make sure that you have no data cells selected before you start plotting these values in your graph. And what I mean by that is to make sure that your cells are not highlighted like this. Make sure none of these are highlighted. Just to be sure, click over to the right into a blank cell. The next thing you need to make sure of is that there are no letters in any of these cells. If you made the mistake of putting your units inside of these cells, you're going to make a mistake when you're trying to plot this. So make sure there are no letters, just numbers in all of your data cells. The last thing to be careful of is to make sure that none of your columns have been merged and centered with any other columns, because this is going to make a problem. In other words, if you somehow previously mistakenly merged these columns, say those two and these two and these two, well, when you go to plot these data, you're going to get an error and it's going to give you an issue. So make sure that none of these are merged and centered. Just make sure they're all in their own individual columns. Okay, so like I said, click off to the right, make sure you're not highlighting any data cells. At the top, you're going to see a tab that says Insert, and if you click Insert, you need to then select the Scatter option, because you're going to be inserting a chart. In this case, it's going to be a scatter graph. And if you click this Scatter option, the very next option, the very first option rather, which is Scatter with only markers, is the one that you need to select. So make sure it's Scatter with only markers, and then you click. So you have a blank palette here essentially, and what you need to do is to first select your data. So this is where you actually tell the computer what it is that you are trying to graph on your X and your Y axes. So if you come up here at the very top, there's a tab titled Select Data. If you left click it, then you get this menu. Well, before you can add any data, you need to first have a series. And in order to do that, there's a little icon right here that's titled Add. You need to click Add, and now you have a series that you can enter. Where it says series name, leave this blank, because it's only going to be confusing later on when you're trying to give your graph a title. But where it says select series X values, make sure you don't click in the box. And make sure you don't click in this box either. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But in order to tell it what you want on your X-axis, move your cursor over to this little icon right here with the red arrow in it. If you left click that, you now have the option to select those values that you want on your X-axis. For 99% of the time, we're going to be using time on our X-axis. That will be our independent variable. So I'm going to make sure to select all the values for time by left-clicking and dragging down. In this case, I have 4 values. Again, make sure not to highlight your title or any words. It's going to mess it up. Once you've highlighted these values, you can release your cursor and then move over here. And now you see an icon with a little red arrow pointing down, and that's how you drop those values into the bucket for the X. For your Y values, again, make sure not to click inside of this box. If you do accidentally, just click out of it somewhere else. Because when you enter your data, it's going to confuse the program, and it's going to think that this is actually something that you want plotted, but it's not. So click up here if you've accidentally clicked in there, and then again, just like we did for X values, to the right you're going to see a little icon with a red arrow. If you select that, now you get to choose those values that are going to go on your Y axis, your dependent variables. In this case, for my constant speed trial, it's going to be my distance markers. If I click the first value and drag it down, I've now highlighted 0 through 15 meters. Again, I bring my cursor over to this little icon with the red arrow pointing down, and I click that, and now I have data that are plotted on this graph. If I click OK, and then OK again, this is what my graph looks like. A couple of things. First of all, whenever you see this little series icon off to the side, that's just taking up space. So if you click that, and then on your keyboard, press the delete button, you've gotten rid of that, and now you have more area. Now there are certain versions of Microsoft Excel where it automatically connects these dots for you, and you do not want that. So what you need to do to get rid of that line, if it appears, in some cases it might not, is to right click on that blue line, and the menu pops up and it gives you an option to format data series. Click that, and then under line color, if you select that, you'll see there's an option for no line. Make sure you pick no line, and then close this out. Okay, so you have your data points plotted, and now you need to give this graph a chart title as well as axes titles. So to do that, take your cursor up top and select the option titled Layout. And now that you're in Layout, you get to enter your chart and axes titles. For your chart title, if you move your cursor over to the left, you'll see the chart title option. By clicking it, you can select the option to display the title above the chart. Now, since this is a graph of distance versus time for my constant speed trial, as you can see over here, I'm going to title it that. So, I'm going to title this distance versus time, and then in parentheses I'm going to note that is my constant speed trial. If I hit enter, my title is automatically displayed above the graph. Now I also need to have axis titles, and to do that, if I move my cursor up to the top and select axis titles, I have my horizontal axis, which is my X, and my vertical axis, which is my Y. For the horizontal axis, there's only one option, and that is to put the title below the axis. If you click this, you can immediately start typing the title of the axis. In this case, it is time, and make sure to include the units on your axis title. In this case, it is time in seconds. If I hit the enter button, you can see down here that my x-axis has already been titled. And now I need to do the same thing for my y-axis. So I go back up and I click axis titles, and I select my vertical axis title. And what I'm going to choose here is to have a rotated title, and you can see it's already displayed here. Without doing anything, all I need to do is start typing. I will enter in the title for my axis. In this case, it is distance, and again the unit, which is meter. And I click enter. I'm almost done. I have my points plotted, I have a title, and I have axis titles along with units. For every graph that we do, it's important that you implement what is called a trend line. It's a line that best shows how the data points are behaving. Are they traveling in a straight line? Are they getting further and further apart from each other, like in a parabola? Well, you need to use your eyes and your brain to look at these data points and see what they're trying to tell you. In this case, these points look very linear. It appears as though that I can get them almost all with one straight line. Now, I've designed it so that all of my data points are perfectly linear. Your points may be a little bit off from each other, but that's okay. If you see a general linear trend, then that's what you need to go with. So in order to implement a trend line, you need to take your cursor over one of your data points, right click, and then when the menu pops up, you choose add a trend line. And now you have this menu. If you feel that the data are linear, you can leave it already selected linear. If you feel that it's parabolic, then you can choose polynomial. Well, if I drag this out of the way to look at my data, it looks like a linear data plot is a pretty good suit for these data, so I'm going to leave it linear. Before I leave this menu, at the bottom I need to make sure to select set intercept equal to 0, 0 if your data should be going through 0, 0. In this case, it makes sense that at 0 seconds I'm 0 meters away, so I'm going to choose to set the intercept equal to 0. The next thing that I want to do is to display the equation on the chart. Because this is linear, it will give me the equation in the form of y equals mx plus b. In this case, you can see that y equals mx, and there is no b, because b, of course, is my y-intercept, which is 0, so it does not show it. If you want to have a measure of how linear your trend line is, you can select display the r-squared value. R-squared value, the closer it is to 1, the more linear your data is. But unless your instructor has asked you to do this, you can leave that option blank. Once we've done this, you can now select close, and this is your data plot. I'd like to get my equation out of the way so I can select it and then move my cursor to its border so that I can move it up and out of the way. And then what I'd also like to do, depending on what my purpose is to add grid lines. So if your instructor asks you to add grid lines to your plot, you can do that by moving your cursor up to the top and selecting grid lines. You can choose it for your horizontal, your x-axis, and depending if you want just the major or the minor or both, major and minor grid lines, and then go back up again to grid lines for your vertical axis and choose major and minor grid lines as well. And here you have a graphic plot of the data. In this case, it was my constant speed trial for distance versus time. Now, your instructor may ask you to also do other plots, say accelerated motion trial of distance versus time, and maybe accelerated motion trial of distance versus time squared. You're going to do that in the exact same method that we did to make this graph right here. And that is the tutorial for entering your data into a graphic plot using Microsoft Excel 2007.